First of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I'd very much like to thank the host, the participants here, the students, the doctoral students that came from Israel and will be giving their presentations tomorrow night. And actually, because we're limited in time and you were so patient, I wanted very much to start with taking a poll of raising your hands of how many of you have immigrated to other countries. How many? I see people shaking their heads. How many of you already had the experience of studying many other languages and remember some of the bad experience that you had, maybe in childhood and so forth, and other people raising their this? And how many of you young students today know so many more languages than your own native language because of the global world that we live in? But after we're limited in time, and somebody a little bit forgotten, which is okay, I want to start actually with the fact that I was very impressed today of how many times we heard the word language or the importance of language or language in different contexts, and the fact that I think that it's most important, and you just justified it. Thank you very much. I would very much like to look into the challenges and the dialogue of language acquisition in the integration of migrants, which is extremely different today because of the masses of migrants that we're getting, in comparison to migrants that came for different reasons, politically, and the way of teaching them a language or the way of teaching younger children or adults to acquire the language was very different than some of the things that I think we have to take into consideration today, very important factors, as well as suggestions from some of my research and experience of how actually I think this should be taken care of. And I hope that some of the people that are hearing me in this lecture will be able to transmit this importance to their colleagues or counterparts, and I'm always ready to give of my experience or expertise advice. So I'm going to begin by actually giving a little bit short background of European countries that have always had the challenge of migration, and the Council of Europe as an international body always had for many years began to develop a migration management strategy in order to assist countries in meeting the challenges of migration. The basic principles of this strategy was the cooperation between countries of origin and the receiving countries, and the establishment of a climate which favored the integration of migrants in host society. The stated resolution in 1437, as you could see, has a very important, made a very important statement that the concept of integration actually aims at ensuring social cohesion through accommodation of diversity, understood as a two-way process. Immigrants have to accept the laws and the basic values of the European societies, and on the other hand, host societies have to respect immigrants' dignity and distinct identity and to take them into account when elaborating domestic policies. This integration, the way I look at it, is actually a two-way process. It's very important and is an essential element in ensuring sustainable results. Integration actually differs very much from assimilation because it concerns both parties, the immigrants and the receiving society. Assimilation is the total adaptation of language, behavior, and values of receiving society, sometimes with the loss of the origin language. The process of integration includes both sides, as I said before. Migrants and the receiving country are open to form new common grounds for living together, respecting the other's identity. Migrants have the opportunity to make use of the resources they bring with them, expand their identity, acquire new concepts and new languages. They can be viewed as enriching linguistic and cultural dimensions of receiving country. This process, of course, takes a very long time and cannot be completed within the first few years of arrival. The receiving country, therefore, needs to provide special integration programs within a very short period of time, especially today, following the immigration, such as all kinds of public services, housing, admission to labor markets eventually, quick education programs to the needs of immigrants, as is pointed out in the second edition of the Handbook of Integration. The goal of integration, actually, is to give the immigrants the opportunity later on, or within the time, to take part in political, social, economic, and cultural life of their new country. At the end of such a process, they can actually, and this would be the goal, live under the same legal, social, and financial conditions as natives of that country. The ability, actually, to speak a language of a receiving society usually plays a very important part in the process of the integration because it's a precondition for participation. Today we know that mastery of the language is not enough in mass immigration. There are definitely other conditions. Many migrants are able to use more than one language because it's the process of immigration. They had the context with other languages. Today, I'm not sure that's the case. The personal experiences of multilingualism makes them much more aware of linguistic issues, of similarities, of differences between languages, and of different communication content. Migrants begin to get bilingual or plurilingual due to their language contact with the society of the receiving country in course of the migration process, which in this case, on one hand, has to be very quick. On the other hand, the language barrier makes it a longer process. Plurilingualism development depends on the psychosocial situation, on the opportunities for language learning, on the quality of the language context in respect to linguistic complexity and effective level, and future options. In my research of second language acquisition in migration context, I actually discovered that the language identity of migrants is very, very complex. The language shift they experience due to their migration and their language biographies are very much influenced by the linguistic situation and the language policy of the countries of origin. Language habits and language capital, the attitudes towards language, and at least towards language learning of the receiving society is determined very much by the very different factors which must be taken into account. In most cases, however, migrants see their first language as an essential element of their personal identity, an essential link to their own personal, religious, and cultural origin, a link to their parents and to other members of the family, and as the only bond to an essential part of their lives that they leave actually behind. Their language represents to them a factor of stability in the otherwise insecure lives that they're coming into. Usually the first language belongs to the kernel of their identity. It is the language in which they start their personal identity, social identity, cultural and religious identity. The more people leave behind, the more important is their first language to them. It is really the only one. This is one of the reasons of that stable element in their lives, why the right to use one's mother tongue is actually a very fundamental human right. From the psycholinguistic point of view, for children and adults, it's also very important to emphasize that the mother tongue is very important for learning any other language successfully. Acquiring the first language actually enables the development of important cognitive competencies which can be transferred successfully when learning a second language. If the acquisition of the first language is interrupted in children too early, then the acquisition of second language cannot be built on a solid ground, especially if the children do not learn to read and write in their first language. An integrational transfer or linguistic capital at work Parents who live, for example, in a stable first language context have the opportunity to, and had the opportunity to learn their language properly in school will very definitely be able to create a better linguistic conditions for their children in all languages than parents who themselves could not develop their first language properly, like speakers of Kurdish in Turkey. First language adult learners first language, of adult learners is also most important on second language acquisition. In my research, I empirically verified that in learning strategies of adult language learners, they make more or less conscious awareness of comparing language structures, and therefore, their first language spoken by the learners needs to be taken very much into consideration in the learning process of the second language or of the incoming country. Adult migrants face a fundamental change in their lives due to migration. They lose their familiar surroundings, their networks, and their social roles. This may represent an opportunity for some individuals, but in most cases it means a loss of their status and income. Many experience a lack of social acceptance, the experience of social decline, discrimination, racism in the new society. Language acquisition is a must when linguistic status of migrants is of people with plurilingual or pluricultural identity, living under the legal and social constraints, contradictions, and facing many economic problems. The free movement of workers in Europe have been looked at for over 50 years by international organizations. My research actually assisted me in developing different models for educational systems. The Council of Europe has so far also been a very major driving force in the discussion of these issues and in developing integrational policies. Their latest recommendations quote that language learning by migrants and their families should promote the provision of adequate facilities for migrant workers and the members of their family, should help them acquire sufficient knowledge of language of host community for them to play an active part in working political and social life of the community, and in particularly to enable them, the children of migrants, to acquire a proper education and to prepare them for the transition for full-time education and work. This is extremely important. That's why the mass migration now has to be taken care of quickly as far as housing and their basic needs, but language is actually a must in actually helping them develop into the society. Another thing that they recommend to develop their mother tongues both as an educational and cultural instrument in order to maintain and improve their links with their culture of origin, to promote the introduction and development of appropriate initial and further training programs for teachers of language to migrants leading in recognized qualifications, also very important. And I also want to add to that, not only the language, the culture, the housing and health bureaus that can help them and that can actually assist them by them using the language and being able to be assisted in some of their needs that they need. So the language here is actually a first priority in linking to all these things and in being able to maintain their social rights. And the last one is to participate in the development of language programs involving cooperation between authorities or other bodies representing the host community, the migrant community, and the country of origin, especially with regard to the production of teaching materials, teacher training, and mother tongue development. Many European countries have implemented such principles in extremely different ways. The teaching of mother tongue was mainly offered in order to facilitate the return of migrants to their countries of origin, not primarily because of the human rights aspect. After a long period of inactivity, it is now regarded as a matter of urgent action for two reasons, as the social problems cannot be neglected anymore in the educational system, in relation to labor market, or concrete conflicts in certain areas where migrants form a high percentage of their population. An urgent need exists also to react due to the social and ethical conflicts which arise. There has been an increase in extreme right-wing parties, sometimes very openly using arguments hostile to foreigners. This has been partly successful in making people feel threatened by migrants. Governments also need to react to these public issues. I believe that in some cases, this has resulted in legislation which is more or less restrictive as far as immigration and access to citizenship is concerned. Looking from a sociolinguistic perspective, the development shows that a certain tendency toward assimilation, which is of main importance to the receiving countries, whereas the question of how far to respect immigrants' personality, languages, and interests is no longer seen as of equal importance. In my opinion, language is a key issue to integration, especially at present time. Knowledge of the host society language is a guarantee for successful integration. Unfortunately, other aspects such as plurilingualism of migrants, interculturalism, and especially social aspects are very much neglected. In many cases, obligatory language courses combined with exams in the second language are used as instruments to oblige migrants to learn the language of the receiving country. This contributes to the notion that migrants themselves may not be ready and willing to learn the language of the host country, which is not supported by experience. Given adequate conditions, migrants are usually very eager to learn the language of the receiving society if the courses are adapted to their needs. This includes consideration of the fact that the time when migrants want and need to learn the language differs. I headed a program in my country where parents learned the new language of kindergarten and school children, of their own children. It actually proved to be very effective. It was combined with an introduction to the educational and healthcare institution, which also made it most useful to them. I believe that the best language learning proposition is by focusing on concrete personal and professional communication area of migrants, based very much on careful diagnosis and consultation process. Unfortunately, many countries prescribe standardized courses with scarcely any differentiation. Adult linguistic competences differ considerably, depending on the contents, where they live, their work, their learning experience. Linguistic heterogeneity is much stronger among migrants. They are extremely different linguistic biographies, depending on the status of their first language in the country of origin. The language context in the host makes it a need to take part and to understand that there are cultural differences that play a very important part in developing language acquisition programs. How could a standardized language program designed to lead a specific level of linguistic competence be effective for all and meet different language needs? Language learning is an extremely individual process depending on a rather large number of different factors. Courses offered for migrants should be differentiated for different groups of people, such as slow learners with little formal education background, learners with an average number of years spent in school, and those who have a long learning experience. As from my sociolinguistic perspective, again, the starting point should actually have different circumstances. the family situation, the learning experience of migrants, and on the other hand, the real needs and capacities of migrants to participate in the life of the society of the other, rather than one level of proficiency. Depending on family or professional situations, the communicative worlds in which people live are very different. I recommend a much more differentiated course system, such as small group teaching combined with the workplace, situated in the learner's neighborhood, and this would be, I believe, much more effective. Language programs designed to encourage adult migrants' second language acquisition must therefore meet the language needs of migrants and take into account also their mental and social and psychosocial situation. It is obvious that learning a second language in migration context differs considerably from the kind of traditional foreign language learning. I'd like to mention what I think and what I would recommend by teaching the designated levels of language. One thing is that language acquisition for migrants should take place not only via teaching, but also simultaneously outside the classroom to a different extent according to the family, the milieu, their family and the job situation. This is one reason why the language learning needs of migrants differ considerably between individuals. Depending on different language contexts and requirements outside the classroom, some need to practice speaking or listening, some need the practice of reading. Here, the issue of dialects also has to be looked at. The linguistic contents of many migrants are not with people using the standard variation of language, but rather a dialect as dialect speakers. It may be essential for their survival, for social context, and for professional success that one is able to at least to understand the dialects spoken outside the classroom. Another thing that I would recommend is that language learning would take place under much more social, economic, legal pressure than in a regular, much less pressure than in a regular classroom. The type and amount of pressure differs from individuals and groups of immigrants and their learning abilities. They are usually aware that they need to master the language of the receiving country in order to basically survive, to stay and be successful there. Therefore, they often have very concrete linguistic needs. If a member, for example, of a family is in hospital, or someone gets a job, there's a different need of communication situation which exists compared to cases of schooling of children, problems concerning the status of residents, which are also important. For this reason, language tuition that does not assist learners in communicating successfully in work, in bureaucracy, in institutions, with health issues, educational context, social and cultural orientation will actually not be sufficient enough or effective. Different situations of learners have to be taken into account when offering language tuition. Experiences and evaluation of language integration program show the need for psychosocial support for migrants by social workers during their attendance of language courses. I've seen many teachers confronted with questions and problems resulting from difficult living conditions of migrants, which actually teachers are not usually trained to deal with. Another thing that I would recommend highly is teachers must be trained for a multilingual nature of classrooms. Usually foreign language teachers see pupils as a linguistically homogeneous group where it is possible to teach a new language against a common linguistic background with migrants. The linguistic basis of one or more languages not always learned properly, sometimes without literacy and linguistic content, use of different languages in families and outside the classroom, and the motivation or pressure to learn the language differ to a large extent from foreign language learning contexts of different people. Many times the migration biography of many migrants' family have even 2 or 3 family languages. Many, because of their family languages, were often banned. many because people from different languages have become members of other families of different languages, and the mixture of languages and of cultural attitudes are very well are varied from class to class. In most cases, language awareness and the ability to code switch with the readiness to mix languages are even more developed between these migrants. Therefore, language tutoring has to reflect learners' language, biographies, and language abilities in order to build up their language learning skills and not to treat them as inexperienced learners. Although bilingual schools and classes and the integration of content and language learning are seen very often very innovative and effective means of teaching language, little research and training has been devoted to applying these principles, especially to migrant language programs. Because of lack of time, I will not go into the issue of testing because I actually don't feel that it is necessary with such masses of migrants. And as far as I'm concerned, it says actually nothing about the individual integration process. Neither will I go into the issue of concerning citizenship and social cohesion, which many times and should eventually be looked at from the ability of the incoming country and the ability of language. I'm going to conclude because I feel that people have been very, very patient here today. In conclusion, language is a very important prerequisite in the process of integration. It's important not to mix this up in the process of integration itself. Language programs for migrants can be very helpful if the complexities of the linguistic identities and different life situations will be taken into account. Programs should offer a wide range of learning opportunities and give enough time for learning. Learning a second language will be most effective if it's built upon the existing linguistic identity of migrants. One must treat them as bio or plurilingual people for which learning a new language does not threaten their status and the usage of their first language. Integration programs focusing only on language of the receiving country and furthermore aiming at a specific level in that language for all will miss this important goal. They do not take into account the specifications of language acquisition in the course of immigrants, which are defined by many social, cultural factors and individual plurilingualism. To promote the learning of language of the receiving country by migrants, it's extremely important to build on their linguistic background, especially in time of and after their arrival, when social orientation takes place. It's important to include the situation of the family and the local and professional context. The consequences as far as language support is concerned, I recommend language courses based on needs analysis with differential curricula, which will take into account the migrant's regional, professional, and family situation. I would also suggest bilingual courses or support for further development of mother tongue, a concept of plurilingualism didactics, and special training for teachers to enable them to teach in a classroom, which are by no means foreign language classrooms, but afford insight into social, intercultural, and psychological dimensions of teaching and learning in a migration context. Access to fundamental civic rights in the vantage point of language learning and not a bonus at the end. The more migrants feel part of the receiving country and society, the more they are ready to acquire the necessary linguistic and competencies to be successful members of that country. Relevant linguistic contexts actually speed up the learning process where exclusion and negative sanctions support retreat rather than include. Migrants have to contribute their part, of course, in their intercultural dialogue, which indeed also needs a common language to be successful. The receiving society must also deal with its task in a two-way process of integration. It is necessary now, and definitely these days, for Europe to promote a linguistic concept different from today's learning concept, language learning concept. It should not be monolingual, but a plurilingual habitus among European individuals and institutions. It should not only be observed and recognized that a linguistic multiple public sphere exists already, but also it should promote its legitimacy. Thank you very much.